Hi, I'm Richard Karn, and you may have seen me on TV talking about the world's #1 expandable garden hose. Well, the brand new Pocket Hose Copperhead with Pocket Pivot is here, and it's a total game changer. Old-fashioned hoses get kinks and creases at the spigot, but the Copperhead's Pocket Pivot swivels 360 degrees for full water flow and freedom to water with ease all around your home. When you're all done, this rust-proof anti-burst hose shrinks back down to pocket size for effortless handling and tidy storage. Plus, your super light and ultra-durable Pocket Hose Copperhead is backed with a 10-year warranty. What could be better than that? I'll tell you what, an exciting exclusive offer just for you.
For a limited time, you can get a free Pocket Pivot and their 10-pattern sprayer with the purchase of any size Copperhead hose. Just go to getcopperhead.com. That's getcopperhead.com for your 2 free gifts with purchase. Getcopperhead.com.
Message and data rates may apply. See terms for details.
Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
It was quite the story this past Tuesday, a story you don't expect to hear, anywhere, but particularly here in Canada. The RCMP charging 4 men, including 2 active members of the Canadian Armed Forces, with being part of an extremist plot, allegedly looking to create an anti-government militia. They had a trove of weapons, and the Mounties said the group was involved in an alleged ideologically motivated violent plot intending to forcibly take possession of land in the Quebec City area. Today on The Big Story, we're joined by Dax D'Orazio. He's a post-doctoral researcher at the University of Guelph. Dax, thanks for being with us on The Big Story.
Pleasure to be with you.
It's a shocking story, in particular because some of the men arrested are part of the Canadian Armed Forces. What strikes you the most here about this? We don't have much information, but what kind of takes you aback the most when you look at these charges, Dax?
I think I had 2 big reactions when I first read this story, and I agree that details have been slim so far, which isn't unexpected for a criminal case like this, at least at this point. The first is just the sheer volume of firearms and other material that was seized. That was quite shocking. I think it is easily a record for this type of weapon seizure in Canada and may even be so internationally. So just the amount of stuff that was stockpiled, I think, should raise eyebrows, if not shock people. The second thing is that Canada is not well known for its militia movements. We have our own brand of extremism and all different various types and subtypes, but anti-government militias are something that we would associate with the United States. I grew up in Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, and just south of the border in Michigan, there is a very strong and active militia movement where people will, have a ranch, an acreage, a large farm property where people will have military-grade weapons. They'll have their own uniforms and outfits, and they'll be doing training, and they will be very ideologically motivated. And according to the RCMP, and in response to these charges, there are people that are perhaps not directly inspired by those specific militia movements, but that style of anti-government military style subculture may be planting some roots in Canada. So that is the other thing that I find quite shocking, because Canada historically, traditionally, has not had many anti-government militia movements. Obviously, we've had various forms of violent extremism, but that specifically may be something novel for this moment. That was one of the first thoughts that I had, that Canada may be experiencing some of the same extremist movements that have plagued the United States for several decades. The other thing that came into my mind as well, and there's been a few articles written about online radicalization. We can't really glean the details because we have such few crumbs to work with as journalists and also members of the public. But a major thing that I would like to know, and the big question mark here, is how these individuals came to be radicalized. And there's been a lot of discussion about online radicalization. And the big question mark for me again is just how these individuals came to believe that stockpiling that amount of weapons was a good idea, and then whether or not they had an actual concrete plan to do something with those weapons.
The CBC reports that the colleague of one of those arrested expressed concerns about comments that he made about the federal government and then Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. And the colleague, according to the CBC, described those comments as, quote, almost treasonous. So, I mean, what does that tell you that Justin Trudeau comes up in this discussion, that, you know, there are those so angry about the then Prime Minister, the now former Prime Minister, that they go down this road?
Trudeau was a very galvanizing force for some extremism in Canada. I never thought that I would see a bustling merchandise store selling, expletive-laden T-shirts and bumper stickers and flags. I've traveled across Canada on several different occasions, and I'd like to think I've visited, a pretty decent swath of the country. And that type of merchandise, mileage definitely varies, but just the sheer amount of it really, really shocked me. And Trudeau just came to be a very potent symbol for government overreach. A lot of this stems from the pandemic, obviously, where provincial governments and the federal government, in order to protect public health, they had to be very aggressive in limiting things like gatherings and demonstrations. And for those that were already skeptical of the potentially coercive power of the government, the pandemic was really a rallying cry for some of them. That's not to say that, you might have legitimate criticisms on where to draw the line based on the severity of the public health emergency and which types of interventions or which types of policies are the most likely to be successful. But for a small sliver of people, that was a really galvanizing event, and Trudeau came to be symbolic as the elected leader of Canada. It's also interesting that Trudeau is, for all intents and purposes, in the rear view mirror, but still may be a galvanizing force for the roughly 10 years that he was in power as well. Canadian Armed Forces, there's another big headline in the last few days of this private Facebook group where there was a lot of very concerning forms of expression on it. And so that is also very eyebrow raising. And the Canadian military has been trying to figure out a way to root out extremists by saying that, explicit membership in extremist groups is not permitted. And also, engaging in expression either within the military or, as an extracurricular activity, so to speak, that might be discriminatory or hateful is also not permitted. But this is an ongoing problem for the Canadian military, as we can see.
Some of Trudeau's legislation also came up in the course of this investigation. A Facebook account belonging to one of those arrested is filled with photos of him in, military-inspired gear, posing with firearms, and Dax posting against Bill C-21. That was the Liberals' gun control legislation. I mean, that certainly gives us a troubling clue about their potential motivation here, doesn't it?
Indeed, it does. And these are some of the breadcrumbs that we'll be picking up over the next few weeks as journalists start to talk to others that were potentially close to these individuals and want to talk about their interactions with them. And we also might get more details as the prosecution and the criminal case is ongoing. Everybody is familiar with the right to bear arms in the United States, and we associate that with American culture. It's something very deep. It's a country born in revolution and a sort of anti-authoritarian attitude. It's just interwoven in the culture of American society. A lot of Canadians, look at that sometimes with a sense of superiority, I suppose. I think Canadians sometimes are a little bit too smug about cultural differences between the United States and Canada, perhaps because they just don't understand it. But there's an almost fetishism when it comes to firearms in some of these extremist subcultures. And it's not uncommon it wouldn't necessarily be uncommon for these individuals to exhibit some of that fetishism of, defending the right to be able to own whatever kind of weapons one deems necessary for self-defense, hopefully not offense, and that they see any government limitation of that as a really concerning intrusion of their personal liberty. I think Canadians and Canadian society and Canadian culture draws that line very differently, and perhaps as I'm showing my Canadianness here, I see guns as tools that are, potentially harmful, and people need to take great care in storing them and using them. And we need to instill that in newer generations to see them, not as something to fetishize, but something to use as a tool. I also grew up around lots of hunters, of course. I'm more of a city boy as I get older, but also grew up around a lot of people that, owned and used firearms for hunting. And yeah, I'm just not. I wouldn't necessarily be surprised that an individual that was an ideologically motivated, violent extremist, to use the lingo, might take selfies with guns and think that they are interesting and important and want to defend their ownership of them from the big bad state. That's a really common thread with a lot of extremists of this variety.
Hi, I'm Richard Karn, and you may have seen me on TV talking about the world's #1 expandable garden hose. Well, the brand new Pocket Hose Copperhead with Pocket Pivot is here, and it's a total game changer. Old-fashioned hoses get kinks and creases at the spigot, but the Copperhead's Pocket Pivot swivels 360 degrees for full water flow and freedom to water with ease all around your home. When you're all done, this rust-proof anti-burst hose shrinks back down to pocket size for effortless handling and tidy storage. Plus, your super light and ultra-durable Pocket Hose Copperhead is backed with a 10-year warranty. What could be better than that? I'll tell you what, an exciting exclusive offer just for you.
For a limited time, you can get a free pocket pivot and their 10-pattern sprayer with the purchase of any size Copperhead hose. Just go to getcopperhead.com. That's getcopperhead.com for your 2 free gifts with purchase. Getcopperhead.com.
Message and data rates may apply. See terms for details.
I always thought, it was difficult in Canada to acquire a lot of this type of weapons that these guys allegedly had. I mean, you point out, of course, there's a lot of farmers in Canada, and they have those sort of long gun weapons for that. But I mean, the Mounties remarked, as you did, about the amount of and variety of weapons these guys allegedly had, and improvised explosive devices as well. I mean, how do you go about acquiring that sort of stockpile, when you do have something like Bill C-21 here in Canada?
That's another really good question. So Canada traditionally prohibits, high capacity magazines, military style rifles. They're still floating around in Canada and possible to get. I'm not an expert in how you might go about doing that, but the border isn't necessarily porous, but it would be possible to bring firearms into Canada. And, the United States, if you've ever seen pictures or videos, if you've ever been to a gun show, I mean, the variety of weapons that's available to an American citizen is huge, and that people can own legally. Obviously, these guns were not, I'm guessing, were not registered. It may have been pilfered. A big question mark is, are any of them taken directly from the military, for example, or some of these things that were siphoned off? That would obviously be a huge problem. Were they imported somehow or taken across the border? Another really big question. So hopefully we'll be able to get some of those details as this case moves along, to figure out how they were able to stockpile that much. Also, a really high amount of magazines as well, and like you mentioned, explosive devices. So they had enough firepower to actually create this small militia, quote unquote, that they wanted to bring about, which is very concerning.
How do we get people to, it's okay, obviously, in a democracy to actively disagree with the government, but how do we prevent people from going to this extreme where I'm going to create a militia, I'm going to seize land, I'm going to stockpile guns because I don't like a Justin Trudeau? Um, why have things gotten so extreme, and how do we stop that from happening, Dax?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's something that I've grappled with a lot I research freedom of expression mostly. And although I've taught courses on extremism and polarization because I'm a political scientist, and it's a really compelling and difficult question when you're researching freedom of expression. I'm often immersing myself in the fringes of public discourse and learning about what various forms of extremist movements think and do, and how they end up in those spaces, and more importantly, how they might get out of them. I don't think there is a silver bullet. We tend to think that, somebody has a really strong conviction and they're so deeply entrenched in a subculture based on that conviction. They feel it is right and just, and so they're willing to go to an extreme degree in order to see that come about in the world. I tend to think about things a little bit differently, not in the sense that ideas aren't important. They obviously motivate us. But when you look at different forms of extremism across the political and the ideological spectrum, in different cultures and different societies, it really is about making meaning and also creating membership. So one of the really common patterns in a lot of people that end up in these violent subcultures is they just might not fit somehow in their culture or in their social spaces or in their family or in their school. They feel a bit alienated from the larger society. And they're also individuals that are attempting to create or feel true belonging, and also be a part of something bigger than themselves and create some significance and meaning in their lives. And extremists, the ones that are actively recruiting, really prey on this form of human vulnerability to belong. I'm just thinking about, white supremacist organizations and how they proselytize and try to appeal to young people. And a lot of that appeal has to do with providing them group membership and belonging and solidarity. And things kind of unravel from there as they're building a narrative about how the world works, as they're engaging with people that seemingly care about them as a person. They feel like they're part of a group. They feel like they have a mission. A lot of that sense of not having belonging, not fitting is huge in the recruitment. And then the other layer to add to this, in addition to that, the importance of human contact and, making meaning and significance in one's life, is just the way that society is chronically online. If you were lost and looking for meaning and belonging and significance, the internet is your oyster. And there are some really deep, dangerous rabbit holes that you can fall down, unfortunately. Now, in an open, pluralistic society, we're always going to have extremism. And the big, messy debate we're having right now is how to draw those lines in the online space, and how do we actually not open up those rabbit holes while keeping the internet as free and open and pluralistic as possible. There are
You may have just hit the nail on the head there with the internet, and I think too, or I wonder too, about where individuals like this, Dax, are getting their information about politics that gets them so riled up, for lack of a better word. I mean, if you're angry at a particular politician and you're only reading news about them from a particular subreddit or a particular area of the internet, you might not get the full story on what they're doing, and you might become more radicalized about a particular opinion because it may be ill-informed. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, of course. And, it's a really human instinct to take something that is big, complicated, messy, structural, systemic, and try to pin that problem on something that's very personal and tangible, right? There are people that end up in extremist movements that have incredibly difficult, messy lives themselves. And sometimes, and history shows us that human nature sometimes looks for scapegoats. Somebody is having a hard time finding a job. They're having a hard time navigating their own personal relationships. They're trying to figure out why. And sometimes it's easy to point to something else as a scapegoat or a reason why you might be lacking what you deem as success. Um, and that's really common in a lot of extremist movements where you have people who have very deep-seated grievances and they're looking for something to blame. I hope that people are just kind of jerks on the internet rather than stockpiling weapons. But unfortunately, things can become that extreme. And so um, navigating that boundary of how we have open discourse and then drawing the line is quite tricky. But there are some really dark corners of the internet, and platforms right now are having a very difficult time drawing that line because for the longest time, it was kind of like the Wild West. And then we started seeing different regulations in different places. And now the pendulum is swinging back in the opposite direction and it's becoming more like the Wild West. Canada might be tightening things up in the realm of public policy when it comes to online expression. If the online harms bill is back on the table, perhaps in an altered form. But if you are looking for dangerous extremist ideas on the internet, you will find them. And researchers often talk about the pipeline, which is, seeing sort of posts and groups and expression that is very grievance based, but it's not extreme. But the algorithms will just keep pitching you more of the same. And so what you can do is almost get on an extremist treadmill where without even noticing it, the views that you're exposed to are becoming much more extreme. And unfortunately, the algorithms prioritize or privilege the more extreme types of expression because the stuff that gets the most attention is usually the most extreme. And so we have a really wicked problem when it comes to moderating online extremism.
Yeah, we sure do. And it seems like we've, crossed a troubling line with this case. I'll leave you with this question, Dax. Where do you see now violent extremism going in Canada now that we've had this situation happen? Active military members arrested, trying to form a militia. You look down the road, are you troubled by what we could see?
Yeah, I'm always troubled just because I'm often following the extreme fringes of public discourse, and the worst case scenario is, not somebody that's very consumed by grievance and chronically online, but somebody that's actually willing to do something about that. And if they're a military member, potentially has access to a lot of firepower. That is shocking and very concerning. The other thing about this case that I think is worth mentioning really quickly here is that it's really broadening our ideas collectively of what we think about when we think about extremism or violent extremism. Like I said, anti-government militias are nothing new in the United States, but in the post 9/11 environment, we had a bit of a moral panic about violent extremism that was inspired by certain understandings of Islam, and then we tend to almost link violent extremism and religious motivation together. And anti-government militia type organizations, I think, is expanding our view of what violent extremism could or might look like. Obviously, I don't think that this is a movement that will keep growing, but as we get more details about this case, I think we'll have a lot more to learn.
Troubling topic, but a great conversation. Thanks for walking us through it. Dax D'Orazio, postdoctorate researcher at the University of Guelph. I appreciate it, Dax.
No problem.
And that was The Big Story. You can send us feedback on this episode or any episode by emailing us at hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca or leave us a voicemail at 416-935-5935. And you can find us on the Seeker app, that's SEEKR, or on all your favorite podcast players. Please rate, review, follow, and share. I'm Richard Southern. Thanks for listening.